There was a recent FDA rejection of a therapy that had achieved, on its own self-described terms, 2 successful phase 3 studies, an MDMA-based therapy for a condition known as, of course, PTSD. You'll be familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder. And they went through and they designed the phase 3 trials exactly as it appears the FDA told them to design the trials. But it came before, and it relates to exactly the rise of bureaucracy. One of these things that's called an advisory committee. The FDA frequently holds these advisory committees where they have experts that supposedly opine on the data and tell them, what they should or shouldn't do. The FDA is not bound by their recommendations, usually follows them, sometimes doesn't. Interesting as well. Now, in my experience, and I've seen the industry evolve for a long time, I was a biotech investor, as you know, I built companies in the industry. What the FDA actually does is they'll often just use these advisory committees as a cover for what they otherwise want to do.
To do what they actually want to do.
Yeah, to do what they actually want to do, and the whole thing is stacked from the beginning. So I'm a big believer in being driven by hard facts. I have sat in the Hilton Hotel in places like Maryland, in the middle of nowhere outside of Washington, D.C., for 8-hour versions of these. I'd be sitting in the front row of these advisory committees taking detailed notes. I mean, that was the level in which I was immersed in this industry. And so I did not do that, admittedly, for this most recent advisory committee. But it smells a lot like a situation where the FDA served up what they call their briefing document to the advisory committee, which the advisory committee then opines on. Think of themselves as a bunch of experts who are actually just being wielded as pawns by the FDA. I've seen that happen before, and it smells like a situation where that might have happened here, where the advisory committee then recommended against the approval of this drug, which is exactly what the FDA came around to do. I view that as a bit of a travesty for a number of reasons. First of all, there's patients suffering from PTSD with very few options. But the basis for denying this approval was particularly fascinating biology, and you'll be at a level where you can easily follow this. So they say the trial was functionally unblinded. So usually the way you're supposed to do this is you have placebo, you have the drug, patients don't know which one you're getting, so that the therapeutic effect is actually a real effect rather than a placebo effect where the patient believes they're getting the drug, but they're not actually getting the drug, they're getting placebo. If they're blinded, the patient doesn't know which one, and then you look at the trial, the end of the trial, what they call the end point, that's the time at which the final measures are taken, and see how the drug could perform relative to placebo. The FDA claimed here that actually the patients knew whether they were on drug or placebo, but not because the trial was misconducted, but because certain of the patients experienced euphoria, which is a side effect, so-called side effect, at least of MDMA-based therapy, and therefore patients would know whether they were on drug or placebo, and therefore could have a placebo effect that could have driven their treatment of PTSD, completely ignoring the possibility that the euphoria was part of the very mechanistic behavior of the drug that might have had an impact on actually treating PTSD itself, which is part of the hypothesis in the first place of using an MDMA-based therapy for the treatment of PTSD. And worst of all, the FDA would have predicted this. Anybody knowledgeable at the FDA around the development of this program would have known that was going to be a side effect of an MDMA-based therapy for PTSD before they agreed on a phase 3 protocol that, to your point on Eroom's law, added tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in development costs to a program like this one. And yet, all the public reads, I read the articles on this, even the so-called scientific press, which at least in the world of biotech is a joke, actually just reports this, saying that there were certain trial irregularities because it's just it was an unblinding issue. So it's not an issue relating to costs and benefits of the therapy, but it's just that the trial might have been unblinded along the way, as though there was somebody who was actually peeking behind the veil and telling patients whether they were on drug or placebo. That's what the public is left with, without knowing that this alleged unblinding was a functional unblinding relating to the actual therapeutic properties of the investigational drug, which the FDA knew about and signed off on before they got cold feet and probably served up to an advisory committee a bunch of briefing documents that got that committee to be the ones that said, hey, it's just the experts that told us we shouldn't approve this, therefore we're not. A lot of detail there, but it does lift the curtain on how this bureaucratic machine operates.